is your first time, you might be wondering, like, is this some kind of nature group or some kind of insect appreciation society? I thought I was coming to a spiritual community. No, you're in the right place. Do not worry. But we're in this message series called "The Caterpillar and the Butterfly," and really, what we're talking about is this universal pattern that is experienced in nature and in our own lives. And part of why we've timed this to bring us into Easter is because it's also a pattern that really is illustrated very well in the Easter story: life, death, resurrection. And if we look close enough, we can see that this is a pattern that plays out symbolically all over the place in our lives. I'll give you an example. We have experiences, we have things, situations, circumstances, systems we create in our own lives, or ways that we understand ourselves, right? And these things work for us for a time, or at least we have the impression that they do, right? And then they stop working, something falls apart, something disrupts, right? Maybe this way that we've been living, it just can't be continued for whatever reason, right? And then if we stick with it long enough, sometimes these things find a way back into our lives, or some things that were broken find a repair. Things that didn't work, even ideas, beliefs, whatever, they start to work again, but in a way that is different from the old. There's something new that has been born. And in fact, it is because we went through the difficult experience or the loss or the change that we are able to find some restoration that in fact perhaps is better, to the degree that we are grateful for the change, grateful for the loss, grateful for the metamorphosis despite its challenges. So we look at the caterpillar, right? And we see that as it goes into the cocoon, or as it goes into the chrysalis, it enters into an experience of darkness, of quietness, an experience of being with the unknown. And yet when you think about the butterfly, the new life on the other side, it was only because it was formed in the cocoon, right? It was only because of the cocoon that we can experience this resurrected, rebirth, new version of itself. And so, spoiler alert, the end of today's message, the hope that really everything comes together in that we would embrace our cocoons, right? As hard as they may be, because of the new life that is being formed in them, because of the transformation that they allow for. So that's it. Thank you. That's it. That's today. No, we can actually do the message. It's fine. Next week is Easter, and that means that today is Palm Sunday. But really, in the context of our series, in the context of the rhythm and the pattern that we're seeing played out throughout this series, it's a 3-part series. And so if today's part 2, then in many ways, today is more like the Good Friday of this journey that we're going on. And for me, I grew up in a Christian community where we celebrated Good Friday and Easter, why we had services for both. And in some ways for me, Good Friday resonated more to a certain degree because it felt like it had a little more soul. There was a lack of resolution. There was a sitting with the difficulty and challenge and unknowing and loss that is actually in many ways truer to our experience of life than the quick, easy, fast, happy resolution that sometimes we experience in Easter. It also might be because I was a bit of a goth kid, but either way, there was something about that soulfulness and that lack of resolution that I think speaks to a deeper human experience. And I also find that we seek this out in our art, right? In our books and our movies. Sometimes we resonate more with things that don't resolve simply and easily. For example, how many of us are familiar with a movie called The Empire Strikes Back? Never heard of it, yeah. Came out in 1980, and some of you are out there, you're thinking, I was like well established in my life when this movie came out, so you're really dating me right now. But this movie came out in 1980, and though there have been many installments of Star Wars movies since then, this is the second Star Wars movie, and to many, it's considered to be the best. Many critically and just in general, it's considered to be the best Star Wars movie that has ever been made, despite the fact there's like 12 others since then. And I'll give you a little insight into why I think this is, right? And to do that, I'm going to do a little spoilers, but you've had about 45 years. So I wonder there may be a statute of limitations on spoilers. I think 45 years we're in that. And so this movie, Empire Strikes Back, ends with the main character, Luke Skywalker, being badly defeated and finding out that the enemy of the series is his father. So it's this gut punch moment, this moment of like, how can we possibly continue? And you also have another lead character, Han Solo, played by Harrison Ford, and he ends the movie frozen in carbonite. Do you remember this image, right? So in the movie, you're not sure, like, did he live? Did he die? But also, behind the scenes, part of the reason why they used this plot device is because it was unclear if Harrison Ford was going to get to a contractual negotiation to be able to be in to be able to be in the final movie. So they actually left him in a limbo state to give them some options. No joke. So this movie ends with all these loose ends, right? And 3 years go by before there is the third movie in the trilogy. And so my theory is that part of the reason why people so love this movie, 45 years now in the past, is because there is a lack of resolution. There is a real experience of the liminal space, the unknowing, the doubt that we are all confronted with in life. And so there is a soulfulness there. And it's something that I think we have the technology and we have the tools to avoid as much as we want now. See, today we are a society and we are a people who have all of the options that we want to avoid sitting in pain, to avoid sitting in loss, to avoid sitting with and experiencing fully the grief that we feel in many situations. Because the reality is we don't have to. Right? We do not have to because we have infinite distractions at our disposal. And we sometimes even have distractions from our distractions. I'll give you an example. When they make television shows these days, they've changed their mindset a bit because how many of us know that you can be watching a TV show and you also maybe have your phone out? And so they call this the big screen, small screen dynamic. It used to be that the movie was the big screen and TV was the small screen. Now, the television is the big screen and your phone is the small screen. And they write television shows to be so over the top clear and to repeat things over and over and to be really like trying as best they can to just get your attention and help you to understand the story because they know that you're on your phone half the time, right? And so we have found a way to distract ourselves from the very things that we use to distract ourselves, right? We're deep down the rabbit hole of distraction. Right? Or how about you? How many of you know this? Like you're watching a show and then the end credits roll, and before the end credits get in, like 10 seconds into the end credits, they're also getting you on the next show that you're supposed to be watching, right? I like end credits, and now I have to press a button just to watch the credits. You're like, oh man, series finale, such a good show. What an emotional note for it to end on. Whoa, and you're letting the credits roll, and then within 10 seconds, it's like, are you ready to watch a girl go to the big city and move, and whatever. I don't know. We have all these tools and things that push us out of the uncomfortability of the liminal space, right? And yet it's important, friends, to remember that resurrection, rebirth, cannot be found without fully embodying the loss and the grief and the pain. The butterfly does not get to be a butterfly if the caterpillar does not fully enter into and dissolve within the cocoon, right? Author Shamali Arda puts it this way. Can you sit in the waiting while I get this to work? There you go. Are we comfortable? The spiritual journey is not about getting out of the cocoon quickly. It's about allowing yourself to dissolve inside it. It's a hard one, but it's true. Where in your life are you cocooning? Where in your life are you grieving? Where are you feeling destabilized? Where do you face confusion and uncertainty about what's ahead? Where are you Han Solo, right? In the carbonite, or Harrison Ford trying to figure out if you can come back, right? Where are you in that liminal space? And are you avoiding the discomfort? Are you able to sit with it? Maybe a mix of the two. Sometimes this does come to us in the form of a literal death, but often it also shows up in the form of a metaphorical death, perhaps a loss of faith. There's a word used a lot in terms of losing one's faith, deconstruction, and it really is the implication that for many of us, our faith was something that was constructed for us. We were handed, And then we entered into this falling apart stage, or this taking apart stage. And perhaps on the other side, there is a rebuilding and a reconstruction that's possible, but it is only available for us if we enter into the painful process of deconstructing. Or Richard Rohr talks about it in terms of order, disorder, reorder. He says the predictable pattern of spiritual transformation is a movement from order to disorder to reorder. This is the universal pattern of change and growth. There is an order to things, sometimes that we experience in life, in society, and it might not even be a good order, but it's what we know. And then at a certain point, even that falls away and it leaves us in disarray. And perhaps we do find a way to reorient ourselves on the other side. And maybe we find that we are better off for it. That as we move from disorder to reorder, there is something important happening in the disorder that we do not want to skip over, as he goes on to say, it's all part, this is all, the waiting is all part of I'm forcing you to practice it. He says, if we try to skip the disorder stage, we stay stuck in a superficial order that cannot hold the weight of real life. If the caterpillar does not enter the cocoon, the full butterfly is not able to, it's not able to at all really become what it has inside of it, right? And to allow that to emerge. We talked last week about this in terms of something called imaginal cells. These are cells that exist within the caterpillar that are butterfly cells. They're the blueprint for what's to come, and yet they are not able to come forth until the process of the cocoon. What is that for you? Maybe there's a strength awaiting release within inside of you. There's a deeper awareness, a deeper capacity for love that is inside of you, right? And it's only through the disorder stage and the difficulty and the loss and things falling away that those qualities and those experiences can emerge. This is a 3-act pattern that shows up in our lives again and again and again, and you cannot get to the 3rd act if you're not willing to move through the 2nd. And so can we even just try to wrap our heads around sitting with, accepting, moving through instability, moving through unpredictability? Now, this is really going to be really hard to imagine for us and really just like a thought experiment because, just as a society, we wouldn't really have any, example of like unstable or unpredictable times. Like we wouldn't know anything about that. It's just something that we merely need to be creative and imagine. I'm joking, of course. It's very easy for us to access, right? Because in many ways, it feels as though we are in a cocoon societally. Even as a species, we're entering into some kind of change, things falling away, things dissolving, things that provided security crumbling and requiring us to enter into a new stage of transformation and metamorphosis. And friends, while the disorder stage that we feel that we are experiencing in society, while that brings with it many injustices, right? Many things that are wrong that we need to address and look to and be aware of, I also want to remind us that the universal pattern that we are experiencing is not wrong. The universal pattern, this is how nature, this is how the universe brings new life through. So can we accept and move through productively these experiences in life? I'm wearing black today because in many ways, today's service is a funeral. It's a funeral for how things were supposed to be. It's a funeral for all the things that were supposed to happen or the things that weren't supposed to happen, right? It's a funeral for the ways that people were supposed to take care of you and they didn't, they failed you. It's a funeral for the way that systems were supposed to take care of you and they didn't. It's a funeral for all the ways that you and I, we did the right thing, we did our part, and we still got screwed in some way, right? I did my part, I did X, and yet sometimes Y just doesn't come through. And it's a funeral for letting go of those shoulds and those supposed tos, I asked for oat milk. I got whole milk, I can't do that. It's a no-no, but sometimes it happens. The cocoon, friends, it's a funeral for the old versions of ourselves. the things that perhaps we are ready to outgrow, maybe a faith or an understanding of life that no longer serves you. And so throughout our journey, we are going to hold funerals for these things, for these aspects of self. I'll give you an example for this kind of ongoing experience that I've had in this way. Growing up, I was taught that when all else failed, when I didn't know which way to turn, that I could always look to the church for guidance, for clarity. Now, for me, within the Christian context that I grew up in, the church was not in reference to a church, but the religion as a whole was considered the capital C church. And I was taught that when my compass felt off, when I didn't know where north was, that I could always look to the church for trustworthiness and for goodness. Essentially, it was the order stage in my life. And yet over time, through things I encountered, failures of people, failures of institutions, the limitations of dogma, I was thrust into a disorder experience around the church and around my own sense of grounding and compass in the world. Friends, sometimes our time in the cocoon is so incredibly challenging because we've lost the thing that has provided us order in our lives, maybe for many years or our entire lives. And yet the reorder, the resurrection, the rebirth has not yet shown up. And we simply have to just exist in that liminal zone. And sometimes, friends, being, when we don't know what's ahead, when we don't know if we're going to make it, sometimes being is the hardest thing. But if you ever think that you're having a hard time and that means that you're not doing a good job or you're not being faithful to your journey, remember that Jesus himself, right, specifically in the story that we really focus on around Easter, Jesus himself had two moments, really distinct moments, where he very much struggled with the cocoon, with having to sit with this unknowing and this feeling of loss and decay. The first moment is Jesus is in the garden the night of his arrest, Garden of Gethsemane, and he essentially has this moment where he prays to God. It says that he is sweating blood because of how nervous and anxious he is. And he prays to God, begging that if possible, he not have to endure the suffering that is in his destiny, that is ahead for him. It's this very human moment we see of deep fear and unknowing, uncertainty. Later, Jesus on the cross, he says, and many people know this phrase, it's very famously, he says, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" We often talk about Jesus as this person who fully understood and knew his connection to the divine and to source, and yet we see in this moment a felt disconnection. And yet, these moments are kept in the narrative, as if to say, hey, this is all part of the journey, right? You are going to, at times, question what is happening and why, and that is okay. And for me, this is why, in many ways, despite many changes in my own faith, the character of Jesus is still very compelling to me because Jesus had skin in the game. Jesus was not some disembodied angelic figure looking at life from a distance, but he was deeply experiencing it, right? It was all cards on the table. And this was why Jesus was so actually concerned with the real social injustices happening in his world. And that's really just a whole other message entirely. But what I take from this, I like how Alan Watts, Zen teacher, puts it. Jesus willingly walked into his fate. He didn't resist death, and in doing so, he transcended it. That is the core of the spiritual path. Not to avoid suffering, but to transform it by going through it consciously. So Jesus is the one who says yes, right? Seeing it all, he says yes. Right? Just as Buddha embraced his destiny sitting beneath the Bodhi tree, Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr., they lived out their destiny knowing full well that it might lead to their deaths, and it did, right? Friends, there's a difference between being ready and being willing. I'll say that again. There's a difference between being ready and being willing. We may not be ready for all that life has in store for us and all the full difficulty of these processes, but we can still be willing, and or sometimes we're just willing to be willing, right? We're hopeful that we can get there, but that's enough, right? There's no promise that, for you to do this right, you need to be unwavering. No spiritual teacher has been fully unwavering, right? But it's what can we say yes to? There's this wonderful phrase in Latin, amor fati, which essentially translates to love of one's fate. It's this encouragement. Can we embrace the full weight of what's coming for us in life, right? The unknown, the uncertainty, and the things that we wish wouldn't have happened. Can we still embrace them because it is all part of this larger process and this journey? So you might be someone where, you're going through a really difficult time with your family, a lack of understanding, or perhaps you're at in your job, you feel like you're being misrepresented or misunderstood, or things just aren't happening the way they should. The security is falling apart. Maybe it's in your relationship, deep challenges. Maybe you're just doing some shadow work on yourself, realizing that some assumptions you had about yourself are no longer working. I know there's many of us, right? Myself included, many people come to this spiritual community and they have expectations that this community is going to fulfill certain needs that it doesn't end up filling, right? Or maybe you look to a person in this community and you expect that person is going to be able to fulfill certain needs that they cannot, right? And so in all these areas of life, we have this experience where the bottom drops out. And the question is, yes, you might not be ready for all that, but are you willing? Are we able to stay in those moments? Because I know many of you, those of you who have walked through that disappointment, even here in this community, you're still here because you were willing to stay in for the rebirth on the other side. That was my experience, losing the security of the church of my youth and recognizing that there really wasn't going to be any avoiding this, right? Once the cat's out of the bag, you cannot get the cat back in the bag. I'm a dog person. I don't really, I'm allergic to cats, so I don't understand this metaphor very well. Why is the cat in the bag? Cat people, can you explain yourselves? Following this thread, not following Fred, following the thread led me, in that experience, to a resurrection of meaning. Letting go of my old ideas of where security would be found, actually, it helped me find an internal power rather than putting all my power and authority on dogma, right? And it ultimately led me to envision that there could be a space out there where there was spiritual freedom. And spoiler alert, that's how I found Aldea, and I'm so grateful, right? But I had to thoroughly let it all go in order to get there, right? Just as in the cocoon, that which is solid completely liquefies, literally. The caterpillar literally liquefies. And in the same way, friends, our stability gets dissolved. Sometimes solid ground in our lives turns to sand. Things that we didn't think could be liquefied are, right? We've all seen those like YouTube videos. Will it blend? Will it blend? And people put, they have these industrial blenders and they put golf clubs and golf balls and iPhones and they can actually, turn these things into liquid, right? There is no more powerful blender than this pattern of life, right? The cocoon pattern. And can we stay there for a bit in that liquefied state? Can we honor the grief? Can we honor the unknowing? Can we honor the fear just as we honor the things we've lost? There is an author named Francis Weller. He speaks, extensively on spirituality and grief, and he talks about in his book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, the importance of moving through rather than around the grief experiences of our life. He says we must have the courage to walk directly into the heart of our sorrow, not around it, not above it, but through it. To truly sit with our sorrow is to honor it, not to rush it, not to medicate it, but listen deeply to its wisdom. Now, we need to be honest with ourselves for a moment that in many ways, what we are experiencing today in our world, in this country, it's an experience of grief, of something lost, of something that we are grieving the loss of. And yes, we feel anger. Yes, we feel frustration. And these are valid emotions. But maybe in certain ways, these are also masking a deeper grief that we feel. Looking around at all these profound changes and so many things in so many areas that feel lost. And really, grief is the only valid, or sometimes the only thing that we have to offer, right? Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was a Swiss psychiatrist who spoke on the stages, and she popularized the stages of grief. She said these are the 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. They are tools to help us frame and identify what we may be feeling. They are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. How many of us know that, right? They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. They are responses to loss that many people have, but there is not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Friends, we can deny what is happening in our lives or in the world. We can get angry about it, right? We can bargain, right? Which means, sometimes it's bargaining with God. Like, if you take this away, if you change this, I'll do something, right? I'll offer something, right? And I've had stomach aches where I've entered into the bargaining phase, But the reality is, friends, bargaining is often just an attempt to remain in control, to feel like we have some semblance of being in control. And then probably after realizing that we don't, we enter into more of a depression phase, which is kind of reckoning with the true loss of control. And perhaps finally, we do find a way to slide into acceptance. But Kubler-Ross still, she warns us a little bit about acceptance. She says, it's not about liking a situation. It's about acknowledging all that has been lost and finding a way to live with it. Friends, there are many of us where when it comes to our world, right, there are things that we are never going to like. Of course, that is an absolutely valid response. But maybe we do find a way to live together, right? Still believing in love and still believing that there is loving community possible here and now, not dependent on something that is going to change in the future, but love that we can create and love that we can live out here in the moment. And so, friends, if we have the courage to stick with these experiences, if we have the courage to sit in the cocoon, as difficult as it may be, something starts to happen inside. That liquid starts to become a solid once more. See, don't forget, friends, that while the cocoon is a place of death for the caterpillar, it is also a place of birth for the butterfly. The tomb is also a womb. And life is nurturing you even as you fall apart. There are some teachers who have, remarked that if you split the word depressed into 2 words, you get deep rest. And these teachers have remarked that, perhaps a feeling of loss or depression even is actually a moment when we are laying to rest ideas of self that aren't working anymore, identities that we can't hold up, ideas of what should have happened, right? And so the question for me is, can the cocoon also be a restful place? Restful for some things in life that need to be laid to rest. And in that rest, perhaps we are given the capacity to dream a new dream. Don't forget that it's in the darkness of the soil that the seed breaks open to create new life. Or it's in the darkness of the barrel that grape juice becomes wine, and it is in the darkness of the cocoon that the caterpillar becomes the butterfly. So friends, maybe as we're sitting between an old life and a new life, certainly we're all sitting at the decay of this old system and this old way of doing things in the world, and we're waiting for a new, better way, and we're sitting in that liminal space, that great in between. There's something I want us not to forget. And I don't want us to forget that the butterfly is the recipient of all of the fruits that came through in the cocoon. Friends, may we have hope for what is to come in our world and what is to come in our lives, but may we also not forget that the real transformation happens in the cocoon. It happens in the difficult moments, in the unknowing moments, in that liminal space. So may we trust the cocoon. May we allow life to nurture us even as we fall apart. May we be open for some deep rest and trust that something more is being molded in us. I'm going to invite Bill to come back up as we close. Next week is Easter, and It's a full week for us before we enter into that resurrection stage of our story in this series. And my question for you is this: can you honor the cocoon? Can you honor your grief this week, your unknowing? Can you honor it as a practice for what's to come? I'm going to end with a benediction. It's a poem written by Irish poet Padraig O'Tuama, and it's called Go in Pieces. And it's about really just being able to sit with the unresolved and knowing that nonetheless something is being resolved as we do so. As I end this poem, Bill's going to lead us in one last piece of a song, and it's going to just help us cement all these things into a reality. Maybe the liquid starts to become a solid once more, even this morning. The task is ended, go in pieces. Our concluding faith is being rear-ended, certainties being amended, and something's getting mended that we didn't know was torn. We're unraveling and are traveling to a place of new formed patterns, with delusion as a fusion of loss and hope and pain and beauty. So, the task is ended. Go in pieces to see and feel your world.